one, oh gosh, what was it? About a month ago now, in Mariupol, Ukraine. And this time we're having it on the internet, here on YouTube, and I'm using Zoom. So thank you for joining me. My name is Maria Willhoit, for those who don't know me or who didn't attend the first lecture, which is totally fine. Um, I am a Fulbright English teaching assistant. I was placed in Mariupol, Ukraine, and I am also an English teacher. Along with Fulbright, I was teaching English at Priyazovsky State Technical University. And unfortunately, I had to come back because of this whole COVID-19 virus. I had to come back to America sometime in mid March, but I knew that I wanted to continue to teach and continue to try to do my lectures as much as possible. So luckily, we have the internet. And as I always like to say, the internet can't get the COVID-19. It does get viruses, as you know, but luckily not COVID-19. So, anyway, thank you for joining me. And I will try my best to answer your questions. Please feel free to make comments or questions on the chat box. I'll try to answer your questions at the end of the lecture. And this lecture will probably be around an hour and a half. I'm going to try my best to be on time. Forgive me if I'm not. And Thank you. And well, this is a series of lecture. This is the second one among 7 that I believe I will do. And please let me know if I'm speaking too fast, um, or if you don't know what a word means. I will try to check my chat box on Zoom and answer your questions. But I'll begin now. So, American History Part 2. This is my screen. This is my little PowerPoint. And last lecture, we covered the beginning of America, early American history. And now we're starting to get into the moment of America's nation and its independence and its early government. And here I had to show this is actually a bronze mask. It was casted, I believe, on George Washington. People are not sure actually if this was done before he died or after he died. They can't quite pinpoint when this mask was created, but I still think it's very beautiful. It's at the National Gallery of Art in Washington, D.C. And for those who probably know me and have seen my lectures, I have a thing for art. I've always liked art, and I like particularly art related to history. And I like this because this is, I think, probably a really accurate face of George Washington. He is highly mythologized, but also highly revered president in American history because he was our first president. And he did a lot of important things for American history, and we'll learn a little bit about that. So, this lecture will cover 1776, when America writes the Declaration of Independence and signs it, and it ends at the outbreak of the Civil War in America. So, and again, this lecture is short comparatively, it's only an hour and a half. So, I'm very sorry if we don't learn everything in American history. I had to choose the main points. So unfortunately, I can't cover everything, but I try to get at least important points. And just for those who weren't there last lecture, it's okay. I just want to do a review of what we learned in our last lecture. So the first thing was that uh, European settlers came to America. They were looking for God, they were looking for gold, and they were looking for glory. And in return, they brought guns, germs, and steel. This was, you know, the founding of America, quote founding, because America has always existed. It's probably one of the most revolutionary moments in all of history. And it changed the entire global order as we know it. And it changed our entire identities, geography. It has a huge impact. And when the Europeans were coming specifically to the 13 original colonies to America, present day now, they were really coming for wealth. They wanted to get out of Europe, wanted to get out of the tight quarters. They wanted to, have a second chance. Some of them were even escaping criminal past. Some of them just wanted to have a chance to make their wealth because at this time, wealth was always inherited by the oldest son. So, if you were the second brother, if you were a girl, you didn't stand a really good chance of making wealth on your own. And another reason why so many people came to America was for religious freedom. This is a period when there's a lot of religious strife, when there's a lot of new religions. There's the Anglican Church in England. The for Protestant Reformation is happening, and so there are a lot of changes. And unfortunately, part of that change came with a lot of religious intolerance. And so, people didn't want to deal with this religious intolerance. So they came to America to try to establish their own religion, create their own community. And as we learned, unfortunately, some of those very people that were leaving for religious intolerance were intolerant themselves when they came to America about their religion. So, unfortunately, the history of humanity at times is a history of hypocrisy. But as I always like to say, history is really about the good, the bad, and the ugly. You have to cover all three, like the great movie with Clint Eastwood, even though it has nothing to really do with history. Um, Another big point that we covered in our last topic, our last lecture, was that many Europeans who came to America were actually indentured servants. They promised to do servitude or service for a settler, a wealthy European in America, in exchange for a ride or a ticket to America. And the key difference here is many indentured servants, first of all, they were European, where slaves were from Africa. And many of these indentured servants could become free. Now, granted, they were treated horribly. They were almost treated just as equally horrible as slaves, but they always had the promise of freedom. Whereas slaves who first come to America starting in 1619, they are always seen as property. That is one of the most important facets of slavery. It's both that they're property, but they also don't have freedom. And their status of servitude of slavery is descended to their children. So it's this long lineage of slavery that we start to create in America. And it really doesn't start to happen until the late 1600s. And then you start to have a big division between slaves in America versus slaves from our historical past. Slavery in America, in the all of the Americas, not just the United States, present day United States, but also in Central and in South America, slavery starts to become racialized. Race starts to become an issue. And by race, I mean it's a socially constructed identity that Europeans and many others during this time period start to associate with people of a different color, skin color, particularly blackness, and particularly being Native American or indigenous. That's who slaves are predominantly. Anybody who has a drop of blood, or even at times a drop of red, quote unquote, is a slave. And Virginia passes a big law that says, you know what, masters, you can kind of do whatever you want to your slaves because they are your property. If you kill them, well, then it's an accident, even if it wasn't. So this is where in the 1600s we start to have a big division in race between whites and blacks, but in particularly blackness and slavery start to really form together. Another big topic that we talked about last lecture was mercantilism and the growing taxation without representation feeling. Mercantilism is the system, a European system of the where you have a mother country like Great Britain demanding goods and services from its territories and its colonies, like the 13 colonies. It's almost like and this kind of system basically makes it so that America can never really be independent. As a colony of Great Britain, the 13 colonies, it's not really America at that point, have to create goods, have to procure taxes for Great Britain. They're not their own independent states. And they also don't have representation in the British Parliament, even though they are taxed. They have to follow British laws. So this starts to grow very irksome in American minds. This idea of, mercantilism and that we can't be represented. Um, so this is a growing feeling, and this is what starts to create a big feeling of independence. And the major point, the culminating point for American independence is the Declaration of Independence, which was signed on July 4th, 1776. And the Declaration of Independence, besides the US Constitution, are the two most important documents in all of American history. And the Declaration of Independence is not only important for American history, but European history, because it does something very fundamental and very strange, actually. It says that human rights, they are granted by God, and they're not actually granted by a king or a queen. Uh, Citizens of a country are not the servants of a king or a queen. They're actually brought forth by a god or creator, and governments are created to protect the rights given by God. They're not created to take taxes, to have their own divine religious rule. Um, People are not there for the government is there for the people. It's a reverse relationship, and it's a very radical one. And because the governments are for the people and they're not there to serve their own interests, if the government fails to uphold these human rights, then the people have the right to revolt or to have a revolution and create a new government. Before there's the idea of divine authority. You have this in France, you have this in England, you have it in Russia. The idea that the ruler, the czar, the king is granted powers by God, and the people are there to serve him and therefore God. It's a complete 180, where no, 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 no. It's not that the czar is the ruler of the people, it's that the czar is there to protect the people's rights. So it's a complete radical idea, and it has very profound consequences for Europe, in particular France, which later has a revolution. That's why I think the Declaration of Independence is so revered in America, because we understand the context in which it was made. It's also very important. It's a holiday, actually. We celebrate it on July 4th every year. And I have to show this picture to the right. This is Joe Biden. His name is Joseph Biden, I should say. And he is actually running for president. He is going to probably be the Democratic nominee, but I'm not sure. His opponent might win. But during a campaign speech, when he's trying to get more votes for people to vote for him to be the Democratic nominee, he actually quoted the Declaration of Independence, but he actually misquoted it. He said, "We hold these truths to be self-evident. All men and women created by go, the thing." So it's funny that this document is very important, but to be quite honest, Joe here is probably he's like a lot of Americans. He probably, at times doesn't know the full quote of the Declaration of Independence. So it's interesting that it's still relevant, the Declaration of Independence, people quoting it, people looking at it for inspiration. But this was a kind of a funny gaffe. And so people kind of just laughed at it. So even our leaders at times mess up our important documents, but it happened recently in March, so I wanted to just share it with you. And also share that this is Joe Biden. He's favored to win the Democratic nomination, which means that he will probably fight against Trump. Not fight, but he will race with Trump to get the to win the presidential race and become president in November. But anyway, that's a whole nother topic. So we left off of the Declaration of Independence, and this is the moment where America says, "Hey, we're independent. We don't want to be part of England." So what does that really mean, and what does that look like on the ground? Well, really, you have a battle. The battle in America, or the 13 colonies, is really a battle between patriots and loyalists. Even though the most Americans were neither patriots nor loyalists, this is a very, especially the patriots are a very loud group. And the loyalists, I think, are important to talk about because they represent a group of Americans who don't want to leave England. And I think this is an important battle to point out. Loyalists by their name, are loyal to the king, to King George and the British crown, I should say, the English crown. They want America to continue to be part of the British Empire, basically. They're called Tories, which is even a present day name now, Royalists, and the King's Men. That's kind of their nicknames. They aren't a very big group. They're only about 20%. And even the Patriots, too, are not a big group. They're probably about 30%, but they're loud, especially the Patriots. And again, the loyalists see themselves as British citizens. They're not angry about mercantilism. Maybe they want to change taxation without representation, but they don't want to leave England completely. That's a very horrifying thought if you think about it. All of a sudden, a country declares independence. Well, what is it going to do now? And I think that scared a lot of Americans. Um, and also, these loyalists tend to be wealthy, older Americans, and they tend to be Anglican. So they have interest to continue the relationship with England for economic purposes, and they have religious ties. They're Anglican. They're part of the English Church. The English Church. They also don't, and for economic reasons, they are afraid of trade wars. Maybe if America leaves England, England will no longer do trade. That's horrible because England at the time is like the most powerful empire. As I said last lecture, there's a famous quote: the sun never sets on the British Empire." I mean, it's hard to envision, but England at this time really controlled the world and its trade, its commerce, and had a powerful navy. So it's like, oh, if we declare independence, if we leave them, will they do business with us? That's horrible. They also don't want to, they fear restrictions. Maybe if America leaves England, England will no longer allow America to trade with other countries. Maybe they will do sanctions or a blockade. So there's big uncertainty as to what will economically happen. Um, and, as the spirit of independence starts to really grow in America, many loyalists actually start to leave the 13 colonies and move to other British colonies like Canada. So it's not like if you support England, you are stuck in America. They can leave to other British forts and colonies. So those are the loyalists. But a louder group, I have to say, are the Patriots. And there was a very famous film called The Patriot with Mel Gibson. It's a romanticized movie about American independence, but I still recommend it. It's good. It's very good acting. It came out in 2000, which sounds so dated, but because it's 20 years ago now, which is crazy. But it's a very good film, and it really does a good job, I think, kind of role playing American history. Of course, it's going to have historical problems, but it was very well received. And it's one of the few movies where you can really see early American life at this time period. Um, so I do recommend it if you want to see it. And there's that famous image of Mel Gibson carrying the American flag with the 13 stars, because we have 13 colonies, and the 13 stripes. And he's part of the Patriots group. And the Patriots right now are actually a football team in America. So that's, and they're named after the Patriots, the group of Americans who wanted independence, because many came from New England, and a lot of the American Revolution began and continued in New England, Massachusetts, present day Massachusetts, New Hampshire, Vermont, Maine. That's the New England area. So these Patriots, which is a very loud group, they're not huge. They probably have about 30% support. They're not big, but they're very loud. Uh, and they want independence for Great Britain. They are known as the Whigs, and they are die-hard believers. And they will fight for American independence, and they do. Many of them are small farmers and artisans. They want to be independent to create their own wealth. They don't want to be told what to do by Great Britain. Unfortunately, many of them are violent. They vandalize and burn a lot of loyalist properties. It creates a lot of intimidation. It's probably why so many loyalists also left America, because they're being harassed by the Patriots. They also have some very famous supporters like Thomas Paine, who wrote a very famous pamphlet Pamphlet, meaning he wanted to write a piece to encourage people to join the patriot cause. And it was titled Common Sense. Basically, it's common sense that you should want to leave Great Britain. It's common sense that you should want to be independent and form an American nation. And his very famous quote here is, "Common sense will tell us that the power which hath endeavored to subdue us is of all others the most improper to defend us." So this is again old English. It's a little bit formal English, it's hard to maybe understand and to translate. But basically, he's saying that the power that's subduing you, which means pressing on you, trying to make sure you stay in line, you don't become powerful. Uh, this power that is trying to push us down is the very one that is not good for to defend us. The very thing that's pushing you down is not the thing that's going to protect you, because it's trying to subdue you. So he's saying England, which is subduing us, putting us as second class citizens, something similar to that, is not the right power to defend us. We need to defend ourselves. So these are the two main groups that are fighting, kind of. They represent the divisions within America during this time period. And then we have the famous American Revolution. And it actually officially starts in 1775. And note, this is actually before the Declaration of Independence is signed. It's because it took a very long time for the founding fathers to gain support among local American colonists to join the cause. And it's probably one of the reasons why the Declaration of Independence is signed after the war starts. And the very first battle is at Lexington and Concord, which is in New England. Um, and it's not a quick war. It takes several years, and one of the reasons for that is because the U.S. at this time doesn't have an army. It has to form one, sporadically, kind of, with George Washington, who was our famous president. Before he was president, he was a very famous general, and the U.S. has to form an army, create one all of a sudden. It had militiamen, this word right here, militiamen, which are just small groups of everyday citizens forming militias or small military units or groups. And I wrote this because it's very important. Later on, we'll learn this is where the Second Amendment comes into play. The Second Amendment is part of our US Constitution, and it grants us the right to bear arms. And we'll learn why that's very important and where it comes from. But anyway, at this time of the American Revolution, the US doesn't have an army. It has to really rely on the everyday American citizen at this time. It's a miracle in some ways that we won the revolution, that we even made it through, because we had kind of a ragtag army, as the musical Hamilton says. We're made of just a bunch of ordinary citizens. I mean, we have some generals, we have some individuals with military experience, but it's not what it is today, certainly not. So, and it's one of the reasons why in the beginning we don't actually have many successes in the American Revolution. England really is winning a lot of battles. The war in the beginning has small battles, and unfortunately, it's a lot of losses to the 13 colonies. And it's only until the Battle of Saratoga in 1777 when we start to turn the tide, meaning the the fate of the war starts to move from England to America, and that's 2 years later. So it's very slow, and it's only after this year that Spain and France start to see that, hey, American can win this war, and hey, we can help them to defeat England, our enemy. So France and Spain helped to provide a lot of military and financial support to the US during this revolution. And to be honest, if it wasn't for that support, I don't know if we would have won. The support, especially from France, was crucial. So, anyway, that's the war generally. And finally, we win the war. We end it in 1783. And that's when we formally signed the Treaty of Paris with Great Britain. So it's a very long battle. It's very drawn out. And it takes many, many years for us to be finished with it. And there are some key, I'm not going to go through all the battles in the American Revolution, but there are four very important ones. And I feel like I should include them because maybe some of you are big military history buffs. Maybe you really love military history. So I want to include this for all of you. So the first one, of course, was the Lexington and Concord battle, which I spoke about. This was before the Declaration of Independence. And this happened when a bunch of British troops marched to Concord, Massachusetts, and they're seizing arms. And they're seizing arms because they don't trust the Americans at this time with arms. And they also are noticing how riled up many Americans are becoming. How this is during the time when we have the Boston Tea Party, and when there are many protests against the British by American citizens, particularly in New England. So the British are like, you know what? We need to make sure that this doesn't escalate, doesn't get bigger. We need to make sure that they don't have power over us. Let's seize their arms, their weapons. It's not literally their arms, it's weapons. That's another word for arms, weapons. And Paul Revere, whom you might have heard about, very famous man, he and other people sounded the alarm. And when he heard about the British coming, he started to tell people, hey, the British are coming. We need to gather. We need to fight them. They can't take our weapons. And it's famous because it's considered to be the shot heard around the world. I'm not sure if there was actually a gunshot that he, used to warn people, but there's this it's this myth, I think, that he did shoot it, and that's the shot heard around the world. It's the beginning of the American Revolution. So that's when the war starts to fight, and it's not with the formal army; it's with small group of Americans fighting the British. So it's a very it's not quite a guerrilla war because it's still very formal war at this time, but it's not like your big war with Napoleon and King George on both sides fighting each other. It's small groups of people just, fighting it out on the farms. Another big battle is the Battle of Bunker Hill. This is one of the first major battles in terms of heavy, heavy losses, especially for the British. This is when slowly the US starts to gain victories. And even though this battle ended in British victory, because of the large number of casualties or dead bodies, unfortunately, that the British got, this is starting to give a lot of encouragement to American military men and militiamen. It's like, hey, we lost, but look how many people we were able to fight and kill. I hate to be brute about it, but that's what happened. A lot of people died, especially on the British side. And then, but still, this is 2 years before the Battle of Saratoga. So things are slow, to happen. And the Battle of Saratoga is really the big one. It's under the famous General Horatio Gates, and he defeats the British at the Battle of Saratoga. Um, and this is an American victory, and this is the biggest one, I would say, besides the end of the war, because it motivates France to enter the war openly on the American side. So now Francis says, hey, you know what? We see that the Americans can defeat the British. Let's join their cause. Let's make sure they can do this. So the French bring their military and their financial aid to America. And so no longer does this become a war really between Britain and the colonies, but it really becomes kind of a world war. But again, this is a slow revolution. It's only until 1781 in the Battle of Yorktown that the British finally surrendered to the US. And American forces, with the help of the French army, are able to defeat the British. It took 14,000 soldiers, and it took 36 French warships to finally defeat the British and force the British to retreat. And so they retreat, and this is when we start to have the Treaty of Paris signed. And this is a very famous image. We can see George Washington, the general, is talking with General Burgoyne. Um, and this is during the Battle of Yorktown, I believe. This painting is made. And it's by a very famous American artist, John Trumbull. And so this is kind of what it looked like. Who knows what war really looks like at that time, but it was very formal. It's not what it looks like today, I will say that. But this is again an image of the British in the red coats and the Americans in the blue coats, and George Washington in the middle. So that's the key battles of the Revolution. And we have the treaty, which is very important for the US because it formally recognized American nationhood or American independence. And the British say, okay, this is your territory. The 13 colonies are yours. Not only are they yours, but the land remaining to the east of the Mississippi River, which I have here in light green, this is going to also be part of your territory. We will give you this territory as part of the treaty. And this is called the Northwest Territory. And it has some major states like Ohio, Michigan, Minnesota, later West Virginia, Alabama, Mississippi, Tennessee, So it almost doubles the size of the US at this time. So, so this is good too because now the U.S. can start to expand to the west, more and more settlement, more and more land. So again, just to recap the Treaty of Paris, Great Britain gives recognition to the former 13 colonies, its colonies, and says, okay, you are an independent nation. You are the United States of America. It also defines the American border, which is important. Obviously, you need borders. It also opened up the Mississippi River before the British controlled the Mississippi River, along with the French and the Spanish. So now it says, hey, okay, America, you can join on the Mississippi River, which is along this border right here. The Mississippi River is one of the most important, even today in America. It really cuts from north to south of America. So now we can trade goods, we can move goods from other territories, other forts and colonies, and we can send them out to the world. We don't have to just go through New York or South Carolina. We can go through New Orleans, and we can also do trade there. And another thing was that the Treaty of Paris also resolved debts. Before America owed a lot of debt to British. So this helped to figure out how is the U.S. going to pay those debts. So it creates a formal payment system. And it also says that any Americans who are loyal to Great Britain during the war, the loyalists, we have to make sure that those people are treated fairly. Yes, they, supported the enemy, but to be honest, it's quite understandable why they did. So this treaty tried to make sure that those people who are loyal to the British were not going to be punished or treated unfairly because now they were part of the new American independent nation. So that's the Treaty of Paris. And I have to show this painting. This, when there was the Treaty of Paris, we had a group of Americans who came to Paris and to England too. They start to do negotiations with England. And as you can see, the very famous one in the center is Benjamin Franklin. We also have John Jay. We have John Adams. We have Benjamin Franklin. We have Henry Lawrence. And we have William Temple Franklin, who I believe is the grandson of Benjamin Franklin. So these are the Americans here during the Treaty of Paris discussions. And it's a painting made by a guy named Benjamin West. But as you can see, it's not finished, it's incomplete. And the reason for that is because the British, who were on the other side making these negotiations with America, they didn't want to sit for the portrait. They were kind of bitter about the war. So this is why, interesting enough, it's an unfinished painting because the British didn't want to be painted, basically seceding or ceding to the American. So that's why it's an unfinished painting. So the British didn't want to sit. They didn't want to show their faces to their surrender. So it's interesting painting. All right. So after the revolution, we have a few important results of the revolution. This is not all. But there is some cultural and social results or impacts from the revolution. So some of the major ones are have to do with land, women, and slavery. The first one, land, as I showed with the treaty, the Northwest Treaty, land now expanded. We doubled our size. So that's very important. And to encourage land settlement, to encourage citizens to go to this Western land and to settle it, the American government passes a law that land no longer needs to be passed down from father to son. It could simply be sold off. So that's very important. It makes sure that land then isn't concentrated, isn't in the hands of just a few people, wealthy people, who just continue to give land to their ancestors, to their sons, grandsons. So now anybody who can afford a piece of land can buy it and can be their own kind of like little ruler. It's so again, helps to create a spirit of independence, and it also is a big reason why capitalism starts to grow in America, because now capital can be created by the everyday person who has land or can afford it. If you can grow your land, or if you can create your goods on your own land, or you have your own property, this helps to create capital for you, right? And then you can sell it. And so you start to have this growing market system in America, this growing capitalism in America. It's no longer mercantilism. It's no longer making goods for the British Empire. It's making goods for yourself and for your nation to then sell. So that's very important. That's a big part of the revolution. For women, this is a very big deal because we start to have this idea of civic virtue, of civic participation, and this idea that, okay, who is going to take care of the next generation of Americans? Who's going to foster this American identity, this American independence? Well, stereotypically, we there are stereotypes back then. Women were treated differently, but the people who are going to take care of the children and create this idea of civic virtue, it's going to be women. And even though this is kind of on a line of sexism, this is kind of a sexist notion that women are in the house and they need to take care of the children. There is a positive result from this, I would say, or a silver lining, and that this is starting to begin the idea, well, if women are going to be teaching our children about American civic virtue, about American history, and about duty to the country, well, they need to be educated, you know? And so now you start to have the birth of these seminaries or these high schools created to educate women, these colleges that are there to educate women, to make sure that they can teach children, about being being a proper American, being a proper man or woman at this time. So, and what we call it at this time is Republican motherhood. So, making sure our young Americans are becoming proper citizens and being part of the Republic or American nation. And I have here a picture on the left, Mount Holyoke College, which I believe is in, oh shoot, I believe that's in Pennsylvania. I'm sorry, I did not look this up, but it's a very, very old college. It's one of the first created to educate women. So, there was a positive result, even though women are still kind of confined or thought to be in the home. At least now they're going to be educated. Another impact is slavery was impacted by this. As you know, America declared independence from Britain. It says, you can't be like a master to us. We need to be our own independent self. We need to have freedom. And you holding us down is not making us free. And that got a lot of Americans thinking this idea of freedom and independence. A lot of them start to feel this hypocrisy growing in America of, well, if we declare freedom and we want to be free, how is it that then we can continue to keep people in bondage? How can we continue to have slavery in America when we're now declaring ourselves to be free and independent from anybody? So people start to notice this hypocrisy growing in America. And thus you have the birth of the abolitionist societies growing. Abolition just means the erasure. the erasure, and specifically in history, in American history, it means the erasure of slavery in America. Abolitionism is people, or abolitionists are people who want to end slavery in America. And the very first abolitionist society or organization, it's formed in Philadelphia, I believe by the Quakers, a religious group in Philadelphia, and it's in 1775. And I just wanted to note here, their movement and this growing voice for abolitionism, um, it really influences the American government. And it's finally in 1807 that we end the slave trade. So you can no longer import or export slaves to other nations or from Africa. Of course, this is what's on paper, and this is not what's actually being done. Many Americans are still illegally trading slaves. Another reason why this was able to be passed, unfortunately, is because, well, by 1807, America doesn't really need to import slaves. It's now been able to have so many slaves reproduce themselves. Through various means. Unfortunately, there is also a lot of rape during this time on plantations. A lot of white masters take advantage of female slaves and they rape them. It's another reason why we have the continuation of slavery. Um, but anyway, so that's another reason why we could end the slave trade. But note, the slave trade ends, but not slavery. Slavery is still legal in 1807. But again, this is one of the effects of the revolution. People start to think about freedom not only for America, but for Americans within the nation, and even slaves who at this time, remember, are not thought of as Americans. They're thought of as property. They're thought of as not even fully human. Um, and I like this image right here. It's an anti slavery image. It's very famous. It's from 1787. And it says here, "Am I not a man and a brother?" This plea of like, am I not a human? And am I not your fellow citizen too? So this is a very strong image, and it becomes very important too, as we'll learn later with the three-fifths compromise, which I'll tell you about later. So these are some important impacts of the revolution: land, education for women, and the growth and the birth really of the abolition society. So unfortunately, we didn't get off to the greatest start with our new country. And by that, I mean, we were going through a rough draft. This is the first time any sort of nation is starting to exist where it's not a government for the king. It's not a government controlled by a king or a czar or a dictator. It's a government for the people, by the people. So it's very crucial, and it's very new that so hence we have something of a rough draft, a rough period in our time, and we passed our first constitution, but it's called the Articles of Confederation, and it's passed in 1781, and the goal is to create a new government, a new central government to help unite the 13 colonies, but one that is not strong enough or one that is weak enough that it doesn't become tyrannical and take away the powers of the state. One of the reasons why we have a weak government is because we don't want a strong government because, hey, we just lived under one with Great Britain. So there is this fear among many founding fathers, many American politicians, and influential people to have, there's a fear of having a very strong government, one that will be just like Great Britain. And so the early American leaders didn't want that. So they made sure that the power was mostly in the states. And some of the strengths, the pros of the Articles of Confederation is that it gave states the Bill of Rights to protect citizen rights from the federal government. So that's important, a Bill of Rights to make sure citizens are not abused by the government. That's very influential later. It also made sure that the property requirements for political office were lowered. So it's becoming so that our government doesn't just become a government represented of the wealthy, but that it starts to represent more and more Americans. Again, it's not perfect. The American government at this time is predominantly white men who are Christian and who own a pretty sizable piece of land. Now, they don't need to own a ton of land. because now the standard for land ownership is lowered, but they still have to own some property. So again, it's not a perfect system, um, but it's getting better. And another thing was they made sure that Congress, our legislative body who passes and makes bills, made sure that it can make treaties and alliances. It could declare war. It could maintain an army and a navy. It could create currency or coin money. It could establish a postal service, which doesn't sound like a big deal, but getting your mail, it was a very big deal. And to do it on a national level is very big. And also to manage Indian affairs or Native American affairs. Congress could also establish courts, and it could be the last resort for states. If two states are having a problem with each other about certain issues, especially related to law or trade, it could go to Congress to resolve this dispute. So, those are some of the strengths. But the weaknesses are bigger, to be quite honest. Congress basically could not enforce these laws. It had no executive branch or president and Department of Education, Department of Energy to help enforce these rules. It didn't have an FBI. It didn't have a Department of Homeland Security. It didn't have really a police. It's just nothing to enforce these laws. So they were really just on paper, just that, just words on paper. It couldn't raise taxes. So how is it going to really form itself, maintain itself, and to have credibility? It can't raise taxes. So that takes away a lot of its power. It doesn't have what we say the power of the purse. Um, and why this is important is because it makes it difficult for the nation, the federal government, to pay its debts from the Revolutionary War. Remember, America, even though it won the war, it has to pay debts to England and to France because France gave a lot of aid to America. So it needs to pay those back. But because they can't raise taxes, Congress can't really pay those debts. It has to rely on the states. And the states at this time aren't really going to be told what to do by Congress. So another big problem is there is no leader of the nation. Yes, they have a president, but there's nothing like what we have today. There's no one that can really guide or represent America for the citizens and for the world. Um, and it couldn't raise taxes, so it couldn't even regulate commerce. The trade between states or even trade between nations. It was completely reliant on states to give money to help maintain it. And of course, states are going to do what they want to do. They don't really want to help the federal government. Um, so and why this is so important, or why this is such a big issue too for the Articles of Confederation, giving such weakness to Congress and the federal government, is that this it makes it harder to create a sense of unity among the 13 colonies. If states have so much power, then they'll start to see themselves as just their own little nation. And so they don't start to see themselves as like an American. They see themselves more or less like a Georgian or a New Yorker. And so, at times you need to, have strong national unity. But that's not really going to happen with these Articles of Confederation. So again, I call it a rough draft because eventually we have to change it and we have to do it again. Um, Eventually, the leaders, American leaders, realize, okay, we can't work with these Articles of Confederation. We need to rewrite the Constitution. So they rewrite the Constitution in Philadelphia, as seen in this image, this painting, which hangs in Philadelphia, I believe. And so they rewrite the Constitution in 1787. And what's very important about this Constitution is it's the same one that we still use today. And I believe it's actually the oldest working constitution, meaning it's the oldest constitution still being used today. We've had many amendments, though, meaning changes or additions to the Constitution, but at its core, it's the same. It's the same as 1787, and it's the same as 2020. So that's kind of interesting. And, it's pretty remarkable that we've managed to maintain that, I think. And this constitution was very important because It grants Congress more authority, more power, and it strengthens the federal government as a whole against state governments. Now, of course, there are going to be people, as we'll learn, who still don't really like this. They're really worried about the federal government becoming too powerful and becoming something like Great Britain or something like a monarchy again. So, even though this constitution is successful, it doesn't mean it doesn't have its critics. So that's our second constitution, the current one. And just so you know, I'll give a very brief overview of the Constitution. I believe many other countries like Ukraine, like even Russia, have a constitution in this similar manner or this similar to ours, although it's not the same, I know. And more importantly, you can have a constitution, but if no one really follows it or respects it, it doesn't mean anything. So, but anyway, our US Constitution is all about checks and balances, making sure one branch of government does not have more power than the other, making sure that they check one another, make sure, hey, you're not doing something wrong, you're not doing something bad. We have the legislative branch, which makes laws. We have the executive branch, which has a president, which carries out the law, makes sure they're enforced. And then we have the judicial branch, which interprets laws, make sure that nothing is going against the Constitution. And that's very important. And our legislative branch is it's called Congress, and it's made up of the Senate, which has 100 senators. The Senate is composed of 2 senators from each state. And then we have the House of Representatives. And the House of Representatives is very important, especially during this time period, because it's based on the population of each state. So California has a big population, it has more representatives, whereas Louisiana doesn't have a big population, so it has less representatives. So that means, Louisiana, even though we have 2 senators, which gives us equal representation in Congress, we only have 5 representatives. So we're not as powerful, we're not as loud, maybe, as California. But we have the Senate, so that balances it out. We have the president, of course, the vice president, and the cabinet, the secretaries. For example, the Secretary of State is part of the executive branch, the Secretary of Education, the Secretary of the Interior. These are all part of the executive branch. And then we have the Supreme Court, which is the most famous and highest court in America. And they are the ones who finally say, hey, this is going against the Constitution. Stop it. You can't have it. Or it says, hey, this is okay. This is okay for the Constitution. And an example of these checks and balances is how we even appoint or nominate the Supreme Court justice and how they become a Supreme Court justice. So, for example, the president nominates a person to be on the Supreme Court, but it is Congress, specifically the Senate, that has to say, okay, this person can be on the Supreme Court, or they say, no, we don't like your nomination. They have to go off the Supreme Court, or they cannot be a judge on the Supreme Court. And then it's only until Senate says okay that someone is on the Supreme Court. So yes, some powers are given to the executive, but some powers are given to the legislative branch, and it's to make sure that no one can do a power or a law all by themselves. They have to be checked by someone else. Of course, that's changed now. To be quite frank, our executive branch is now probably equally, if not more times, more powerful than the legislative branch. Um, and the judicial branch is still powerful, but the other branches are becoming even more powerful, I think, at times, and more influential. So, anyway, that's what our Constitution created. It created our government. It outlines and explains how specifically the government of the United States is going to be. And it has some very famous words that I just want to point out to you. And these are very famous words that you've probably heard also on TV or in newspapers, and that is "we the people." And that's very important that our Constitution comes from those words, because it's a reminder that the government, again, is for the people, by the people. It's not supposed to serve its own self-interest. It's not supposed to serve other nations' self-interest. It's supposed to be from the people. And the Constitution is the supreme law of the land. No other law, that even by the states, can supersede or overall our Constitution, our national Constitution. And if there's a problem between the national Constitution and the state constitutions, then the Supreme Court has to come in and decide who's right, who's wrong. Um, and the government is formed in terms of, it explains what rights and limitations the US government has and what we have. And anytime we want to change the Constitution, which is very difficult to do in America, you have to have a majority, I believe, of the Senate vote for it, or you have to have the majority of the state governments vote for it. Um, Anytime we have an amendment, it has to be through a majority vote. And that's why only so far today, we only have 27 amendments. I don't know if that sounds like a lot to you or not a lot, but for being a nation of over almost 250 years old, we've only had 27 amendments. So it's a big deal if we want to change the Constitution. And the very beginning words of the Constitution are, "We, the people of the United States, in order to form a more perfect union, establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility, provide for the common defense, promote the general welfare, and secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our prosperity, do ordain and establish this Constitution of the United States of America." So, this whole entire sentence, it's actually one sentence, explains what is the purpose of the Constitution. It's to create unity, it's to make sure we have justice, it's to make sure we have general tranquility, general happiness among our population, it's to make sure we have defense, and it's to make sure we have general welfare or security in our lives, meaning you can get a house, you can have food, welfare. Make sure you have general welfare, sustenance for your body. And of course, the government and the Constitution is there to make sure we have the opportunity and the blessings of liberty. It's the Constitution is not there to hinder our liberties, it's there to promote it and to encourage it and to make sure it can happen. And it's not just to ourselves right now, but to our posterity, or our families, our children, our grandchildren, our lineage. And that's why we established this Constitution. It's for those various reasons. So I just wanted to point that out. It's a very famous quote. Um, and another important part of our Constitution is the Bill of Rights. So when the Constitution was passed, we didn't have a Bill of Rights. And there were many people that we call later anti-federalists. They're against the federal government. They're against the big federal government. They're worried that the government, the national government, can be too powerful. And they want to make sure that the rights of citizens are still protected, that the liberties of an everyday American are protected and they have the liberties. So, a great president named James Madison, this is before he's president, he writes a Bill of Rights. And bill, almost as you think about it, bill is what you owe, right? Like when you get a bill from a restaurant, it says, hey, you owe $10 for your meal. This is kind of a similar ideology in the sense that, hey, national government, it's like a bill to the national government. Hey, if you want to be a national government, you want to have these powers, you owe the people these rights. So it's like, that's why they call it, it's a bill in the sense of it's a law, but it's also a bill in concept in terms of this is what the federal government owes to its people. It owes these amendments, these freedoms. I won't go through all the amendments, but there are some really important ones. I would argue that the first amendment, being the first, is the most important. The First Amendment grants freedom of speech, freedom of the press, freedom of religion, freedom of assembly, which means to gather or to protest, even, and the right to petition the government to citizens. And especially the freedom of speech. That is the most important amendment to our Constitution. I would argue it's the most important right to American citizens. So, um, and the Supreme Court has always been very strict and has done its very best, I think, to protect this freedom of speech. Now, you can't go into, this is a famous example, you can say whatever you want, but you can't create violence or terror as a result of that. You can say horrible things about the president, you can say horrible things about groups of people, but you can't create violence or create an atmosphere of violence. There's a fine line. You can't run into a crowded theater and yell fire, fire, because that creates panic. That creates violence. People are getting worried they might kill each other, hurt each other. So you have a freedom of speech up to a certain point. You can't do whatever you want. But generally, again, the Supreme Court favors a freedom of speech for someone over taking it away. The same with religion. The national government, the American government, has no official religion. It's not allowed to have an official religion. Yes, we have the phrase "In God We Trust," but you're not allowed to invoke a national religion. You're not allowed to establish one. But at the same time, the federal government is not allowed to infringe on your right to your beliefs of a religion. It's not the federal government cannot prohibit you from practicing a religion, no matter what it is or no matter what they think of it. Um, and of course, there's a lot of gray area where it's not a perfect division between when it's okay to have freedom of religion, when is it okay for the federal government to step in. That's why we have a Supreme Court government to help resolve these disputes and these debates. And I have to point out the Second Amendment, the right to bear arms. Bear does not mean like a teddy bear or an animal. It means to hold, to own, and to hold. And arms does not mean my arm. It means weapons, guns, knives. I'm not even really sure all the entire definition, but today it really means guns. So and this is a very controversial debate in America because there are many people who support the right to bear arms, the right to have guns, to buy guns. But there are also, because of our mass shootings, we have a lot of them in America. Because we have these shootings, there are many people who say, we have the Second Amendment, but we need to make sure that the Second Amendment is controlled. We need to make sure, that there are restrictions on who can have guns. But then there are people who say, no, this is an amendment. This is a right. You can't restrict it in any way. We have the right to bear arms. So there's that debate. And these are the others you can read about. I think hopefully this video is being recorded, so you can always look back at this video and read more about the amendments. But these are the first 10 amendments, and they're extremely important. And this was the creator, James Madison. Now, as I was saying, there was a debate among American leaders about, do we want a strong federal government or do we want very strong state governments? And the word federal comes from the word, it has to do with the idea of federal government. And so federalists are people who want a very strong national government. They don't want states to be weak, but they want a strong national government because they understand that there's this need to have unity, there's this need to have cohesion, there's this need to have a national American spirit. And these Federalists, most famously Alexander Hamilton, of which you might have heard of from the musical Hamilton, George Washington, John Jay, who was the first Supreme Court justice, and then James Madison, the writer of the Bill of Rights. These people were famous Federalists. They wanted a strong national government, as I said. They wanted a national bank. We didn't have a national bank. They wanted something like what we have now, a U.S. Treasury that can help pay for, that can help the United States do banking, paying its debts, creating currency, all the functions that a bank has. The Federalists want the national government to have. They support the 1787 Constitution. And they write, in order to create support for this Constitution, our current one, they write the Federalist Papers. And to be quite honest, the majority of those papers were written by Alexander Hamilton. He is probably the loudest Federalist. And this is a picture of him right here. He's also on our $10 bill. So that's Alexander Hamilton. But again, There are Federalists and there are Anti-Federalists. And the most famous one is Thomas Jefferson. You also have James Monroe, Patrick Henry, and Samuel Adams. And these anti-federalists, they are very weary of a strong national government. They want to have strong state power. And it's not that they don't want a federal government, but they want to make sure that if a state wants to do something, that they can generally do it. They don't want to, they are fearful of having something, again, like mercantilism, like a a colonial relationship with Great Britain. They don't want to go back to what it was like under Great Britain. So they're very fearful of a very strong state government, and they want the states to have the power to decide how they're going to create money. They don't want to be told what to do by a federal government that has representatives from New York what to do for Virginia. Let Virginia decide what Virginia wants to do with its money. And again, this anti federal feeling comes from a strong central government fear that was similar to Great Britain and England, what England was doing to America. But they finally support the Constitution of 1787 with the promise of a Bill of Rights. And remember, that Bill of Rights is a promise that American citizens shall have these rights and that the federal government cannot take away these rights. So, and the man here who looks like he's kind of scowling, this is Thomas Jefferson. So, he is our most famous anti federalist. He's later a president. He's just a very famous American figure. As you know, he wrote the Declaration of Independence. So, however, before I move on, I just want to mention this. This is an ugly part of our history, but it needs to be told. We have the Three-Fifths Compromise Clause. So, as I showed you, the American government is formed with the legislative branch, and that branch is made up of 100 senators and right now 435 representatives, but back then it was much less because we had a smaller population. Our House of Representatives is determined. How many representatives you get in each state is based on your state population. But what do we do about slaves? How do we count slaves in our government? This is a tricky situation, and African American slaves, make up 40% of the Southern population. They are not a small group of people. And Southern delegates could have more power, they could have more representation. So they want to have their slaves counted as part of their population. However, Northerners, who are kind of against Southern politicians having more powers, they're like, well, hey, slaves are property. They're not humans. They shouldn't be considered part of your representation. They're not people, right? And so, because slaves are property, the Northerners, Northern delegates, Northern politicians don't want to count slaves as part of Southern representation. So there's this battle, and they end up with a compromise, and it's a very ugly compromise. We call it the Three-Fifths Compromise. It's a fraction. And it's basically that each Black person, each slave, would be counted as 3/5 of a person when determining congressional representation for each state population. Or if you have 5 slaves, 5 Black Americans, 3 of them out of the 5 would be considered part of the population. You can think of it that way. This graphic is good. It shows a Black American with part of its body cut off or not really shown. Ooh, excuse me. Sorry, guys. And it's kind of the idea of this. He's 3/5 of a man. That's basically what the Three-Fifths Compromise is saying. Well, you're kind of a semi-human. You're not quite a human, but you're not also not a human. And of course, they're human because they're a person. But on paper, they're a slave and therefore they're property. So it's this very weird, messed up identity and compromise that the American leaders create for the slave population. And this has enormous repercussions for race in America, especially racism in America, because, For a very long time, slaves and later slaves who become free, Black Americans, they always have to live with this idea that at the time of America's beginning, even before the Constitution, they are never fully seen as human. They are property, and even when they are no longer property, they're still seen as and treated like three-fifths of a person. So they're never quite fully a man. They're never quite fully a woman, and they never quite fully have the rights and liberties as other Americans. So the mentality of the three-fifths compromise more than anything creates a mentality among many Americans, especially white wealthy Americans at this time, white leaders, white politicians, that Black people, slaves, are not quite a human being. And because of that, they're not quite capable of certain rights and liberties. And this has repercussions even to today. And there is that famous phrase that many Black leaders, civil rights leaders say, I am a man. And you think, well, of course you're a man. Like we think that today, of course you're a man. But you have to understand it comes from this idea that, and starting with the beginning of our country, Black people were not men, they were not women, they were something below that. They were three-fifths human. And if that's at times they were even treated not even like a human, they were treated as property, as animals. So I want to point that out because it's a very ugly uh, compromise and it has legacies to today. All right. So I do have to, I think I need to, I thought I want to move on, but I felt like I had to create a PowerPoint or a slide on President Washington, George Washington, because he is our first president and he's very famous. So I think you should know a little bit about that, him and the precedents, the traditions that he creates in our country. First of all, he's our first president of the United States with our current constitution, and hence he's on the $1 bill. He's also on our 25-cent quarter. So he's just very famous. He insisted on only having the title of president or president. He didn't take the title of Lord or King because, again, he didn't want to be like Great Britain. We are not a monarchy. We are not something of royalty. We're not a dictatorship. I am a president. I have no regal titles. And it sounds obvious to us he would create that title, but that was a big deal. You know, no leader at the time was called a president at that time. Everyone else was Lord and King, Queen, and Czar or whatever. So this is really radical. What's also radical is he doesn't just stay president for 20 years, 40 years, something like you have now in Russia with Vladimir Putin. He creates a revolving door after his second term. Each presidential term is 4 years. He only stays for 8 years. He has two terms. And he decides after 8 years, you know what? I'm gonna step down. I'm gonna let someone else lead the country. We're not gonna have a dictatorship where I'm here 50 years. And again, it creates a tradition of our presidents only serving 8 years maximum, 4 years minimum. And yes, that has its good and its bad, right? Because the door is revolving, things don't always stay consistent. But at the same time, no one ever gets power hungry, really. Um, Another big thing he decides to do during his presidency is he is neutral during the French Revolution. By this, he means we don't take sides either on either side of the French Revolution. We don't support the monarchy, but we don't support the Jacobians, the people who are trying to overthrow the French monarchy. So it creates a foreign policy of isolationism, meaning we don't get involved in other countries' affairs. And this lasts really, to be quite frank, until World War One with President Wilson. And even President Woodrow Wilson during World War One, we entered World War One very late. I think 1 year before it ended. I mean, we are very slow. And it's only until World War Two, like 200 years later, well, 150 years later, that we finally start to become engaged in global affairs. But for a very long time, it's nope, don't want to get involved. So another thing he did during his presidency is he warned against political parties. He saw the fighting that was happening between the Federalists and Anti-Federalists, and he saw how awful that could be, how it could create division in our society. And quite frankly, he could not be more right. Um, right now, we are really divided. Even in this coronavirus epidemic, we're having political debates when we shouldn't be having them. So anyway, he foresaw that. He owned a very famous home, farm really, and he had slaves actually. His home was known as Mount Vernon, and it's in Virginia. He had slaves, and he knew that was wrong. He knew that was the wrong thing to do. So he made sure that upon his wife's death, and it's his wife because his wife actually owned the slaves. He didn't. His wife was actually wealthier than he was. He made sure that when he died and when she died, that they would become free. So um, it's always going to be this issue of early American presidents dealing with slavery and freedom at the same time. We have this weird juxtaposition in our country of we were founded on freedom, but we are also founded on slavery. And many historians would say that without slavery, America could not understand freedom. It could not fight for its freedom. It could not create this ideology and the spirit of freedom without slavery. The two went hand in hand. So, and that's why I bring up Thomas Jefferson, who dealt with this problem. Thomas Jefferson, as you know, wrote the Declaration of Independence. He was an anti Federalist. He was our third president of the United States. He was our first Secretary of State. He owned a plantation, Monticello, and he owned slaves. His most famous being Sally Hemings, whom I believe he had an affair with and had children. But it was always an awkward thing he acknowledged and didn't acknowledge at times. During his presidency, we'll learn about this later, but the US acquired the Louisiana Territory from France. This was a massive chunk of land in America, which I'll show you later, that the US got from France during under Napoleon. And I have to add it because I'm from Louisiana, I am from New Orleans. And so this is when we come into play. But the Louisiana Territory is it's not just Louisiana, it's like all the states above us. It was a huge, massive state territory. So he acquires the Louisiana Territory, creating greater land and size for America. And he also founded the University of Virginia, which is a very famous public university in Virginia. And here's this picture to the right. But on the left, I have here an image that I took, a photo that I took. It's from the National Museum of African American Culture and History. And this museum opened about, I think, 2 years ago. And here we have the words Declaration of Independence. And they created this monument of Thomas Jefferson. This is him. This is Thomas Jefferson. And we have the words of the Declaration in the back here. Actually, it's down here. But below here, I don't know if I can zoom in very well, laid behind him, and they have different names of the various slaves that he owned. These bricks have the name of slaves that he owned. I believe it's all of them. And so this monument, so to speak, is supposed to show how, yes, we have the Declaration of Independence. We have this birth and idea of freedom in our country. But in the midst of that birth of freedom, we have slavery. And without slavery, really, we could not build our country. And that's why we have the names of the slaves on bricks. It's this idea that America was built on slavery and it was built by slaves' hands. So it's this uncomfortable image we have at this museum, which I think is very beautifully done, of this background of freedom and independence, and the man who is kind of credited with really creating that freedom, or not creating it, but really promoting it. But behind him are all the names of all the slaves that he owned. So it's this very uncomfortable image and this uncomfortable setting that is always existing in America. And it exists today. This idea that we were created on the promise of freedom, but at the same time, we had slavery, and even today we have racism, we have sexism. Um, and I know some of you might say, well, every country has that. Every country has those problems. And yeah, that's true. But I feel as an American, we're especially hypocritical if we always claim to be a land of the free, home of the brave, and yet at the same time, we don't not everybody has freedom. And some people are treated with a lot of injustice in our country. And there are some people who want to ignore that. But there is a part of me that truly believes we cannot become a better country. We cannot progress as a country if we do not address the injustices in our country. And you know what? That may take our entire lifetime. That may take forever. But that is the consequence of our country. That's the consequence of our origins, our history. That the fact that we were born in freedom and born in slavery. So but to continue, and I hope, I'm sorry I'm taking so much time, guys. This is actually, even though it's only 100 years we're covering, a lot happens. A lot of important things happen. So I will try my best to at least finish in about 15, 20 minutes. So forgive me. Um, so to continue, we have our Constitution. We're starting to grow as a nation, but things aren't so peaceful between the British and the Americans. After we become a nation in 1787, we still actually have problems with the British. Nothing, we have a peace treaty, but things aren't so peaceful afterwards. There are still British forts, troops, and settlers in North America. We have to remember that. Canada has a lot of British people, and also in Western United States, west of the Mississippi, there are British colonies, British forts. So the British never fully went away. And there is this horrible thing that they're doing to our sailors. If U.S. sailors go out into the waters, some British ships are taking them and making them join the Royal Navy. This is called impressment. And they're doing this in part because some of these British ships are claiming that they're on British waters, or that these American sailors are still citizens of the British Crown. So, and it's creating this, it's creating this division, and it's creating this resentment among Americans. Hey, they're taking our sailors. Um, Another big problem is that beginning in the 1800s, Great Britain is fighting France, which is under Napoleon Bonaparte at this time. They're having a big war. And to make sure that America did not get involved, and especially didn't help the British, but even the French did this, both sides passed sanctions on the US. Both sides passed laws that says, hey, America, you can't do trade with the British. And Britain said, hey, America, you can't do trade with the French. And these are some of our biggest trading partners. So this angered a lot of Americans, especially American politicians, leaders. It's hurting us economically. Um, and really, I mean, because of those two main reasons, we have another war, a war of 1812. Um, and this war breaks out between the US and Britain, and also with Native American groups and Canadian troops, because some Native Americans join the British, some Native Americans join the Americans. It's a little bit complicated, but anyway, we have a war. It breaks out. It's not a very massive war, it's not very long, but it's still important. Um, One of the reasons why it's important is for two reasons. They burned the capital, Washington, D.C. So, Washington, D.C., which was brand new basically at the time, has to be rebuilt. So, that's costly. And another very important reason why the war is important, sorry, that's a little bit redundant, but is because we finally get our national anthem during this war. The Star Spangled Banner, our national anthem that we sing usually at the beginning of sports events, football games, any national holiday, especially Independence Day, we sing the Star Spangled Banner. It's written during this war, and it's written by Francis Scott Key, who was witnessing the bombing in Baltimore, Maryland. And he was inspired by what was happening and wrote the Star Spangled Banner. And at the end of this PowerPoint, I'll show you the lyrics. So that's another reason why the war is important. We have our national anthem. So the US wins. and it has a treaty with Britain. It's called the Treaty of Ghent. And this treaty is very important because it finally says in finality, before I guess it wasn't final, it finally says and solidifies the US's independence. Okay, Britain says basically, you are independent. We will not meddle in your affairs. It also showed America's strength and power for the world stage. We're starting to have a growing presence on the world stage. We're defeating one of the most powerful empires in the world, the British Empire. So it's important for that reason, this war. And honestly, again, more importantly, probably we gain a huge chunk of land in the West. Uh, and so this is how the US starts to expand and becomes bigger and bigger. And I'll show you right now US expansion. So during the late 1700s, mid 1800s, we grow to the country that we really know today. We gain Alaska later, actually. But we have the original 13 colonies here. And during, remember, the Treaty of Paris after American independence, we gained the entire Northwest Territory. Under Thomas Jefferson, we gained the Louisiana Purchase. It's massive. As I said, it's not just Louisiana, which is where I am, it's all this territory. And here is New Orleans. But anyway, this is a very important piece of land because now we're to the west of the Mississippi River. And then we also gained territory here and in the what's called Oregon country, but it's really Washington State, part of Montana, part of Idaho, and Oregon now. So we're starting to grow as a big, big nation. And later on, as I'll mention, we also grow due to we have a Mexican American War, which I don't really touch upon because it's also another big topic. But because of our Mexican American War in the 1840s, I believe, we gain all these other Western states: California, Nevada, Utah, New Mexico, Arizona, Colorado. So we're growing. And Texas is a very strange story, but a group of American settlers basically fought the Spanish and the Mexicans, and they claimed Texan independence. And then later, after Texas was independent in its own republic, we decide to annex it. So Texas is a strange story. But anyway, as you can see, we start to really grow as a nation. I would say over 75% or 75% of land that we gain comes from this period after our independence and before the Civil War. And this starts to have serious ramifications, which I'll talk about in a few slides. There are consequences for this expansion of land. And most importantly, the consequence of, are these lands and these new states that come from these lands, are they going to be slave states or free states? Even though slavery is legal in America, some states don't want to have it, and they have the right to not have it in their state, to ban it from their state. So as we expand to the left, we have to decide, are we going to are we going to have slavery or not? And this is honestly the precursor, kind of the warning and the cause for the Civil War in America. And but at the same time, because of this growth in land, we have a growth in people and a growth in wealth. It's called the American system. So during the early 1800s, we're starting to have our industrialization, or the birth of the industry movement in our country, the birth of factories and large industries in our country. Factories are opening up in the north. And as a result, we have to create railroads, we have to create telegraph lines, excuse me. And many of these factories are clothing factories. They're producing a lot of cloth and a lot of clothes. And to support their manufacturing, they need raw material. And that raw material is cotton. And so cotton becomes the most important material created in America at this time. It's the raw material for the clothing factories in the north. and all this cotton was being picked by the slaves. And not only is cotton going to the north, it's also being exported to countries like Great Britain. The city of Liverpool is a very famous city. It's becomes one of the largest city in Great Britain during this time. It's imports a lot of cotton from America, and it creates clothing too. It creates textiles, what we say for clothing, textiles, fabrics, and materials for making clothes and other material goods. So we have this huge growth in our industry, and cotton is the largest material that we grow, that we export, and that we use for production. And that's why I have an image here of the cotton gin, because cotton is picked by slaves in the plantation field, but it has to be separated to be woven into thread. So there was a man named Eli Whitney who created the cotton gin, and not gin the alcohol, but similar in the sense that it's being processed or distilled. The cotton goes through this machine, and it's separated. Its fibers are separated, and it's turned into a very thin piece of material that you can later make into string. So it, because of the congen, our pace and our speed of manufacturing increases, and thus our production and our exports increases, and also slavery increases. The demand to produce cotton makes a demand on slave labor and slave reproduction. So that's very important. Another big reason for this land and another thing for the land and growth, not only do we have a growth in wealth, we have a growth in people to support these new factories, but also to support settlement in these new lands that we've now acquired. We have a huge growth in immigration. We have an even bigger one in the next century. But as you can see on the left hand side, we have a number of immigrants in the thousands. We don't have many in the early 1800s, but we're starting to grow. We have 500,000 in 1830. We have over a million, actually 1.5 million in 1840. And by the beginning of the Civil War, we have 2.5 million Americans immigrating to our country. That is a staggering amount of immigrants in our country. So we have more land, we have more people, we're starting to have more production. So all of this is creating an American system. More land means more population, means more food, means more industries, and that creates greater wealth, and the cycle continues. The wealth means we have then more production, more cotton. It means we have more settlement, more land buys. Um, and it also means we have more agricultural production to feed this growing number of slaves, immigrants, and native born Americans. We need to produce more agriculture. So a lot of these states have greater farming. We also have to transport all this food and these goods that our farmers and our settlers are making across our country. I mean, we just expanded almost 3 times our size. So we have to create a national railroad line. We have to make sure we have proper communication. So America has to kind of grow up really fast. Um, and it's why we have such a massive industrial system in our country at the height of the Civil War, but even afterwards, it continues to grow. So I just want to point this out, like land expansion has serious repercussions for us. And there's another repercussion or consequence for this. We have a president named Andrew Jackson, whom you may or may have not heard of. He's on our $20 bill. And I'll explain why there's a movement right now to even remove him on the $20 bill. He is our 7th president. He is a president during this time period right before the Civil War. He's born on Native American territory, actually, in South Carolina. He becomes president, and unlike George Washington, like Thomas Jefferson, he's kind of an anti federalist. He doesn't like big government. He doesn't like the national bank. He's definitely more of a states' rights leader. He comes from a poor community, so he kind of represents more of the average American. He is a famous general. He fought in the Battle of New Orleans during the War of 1812. But something that he's becoming famous for, and why some people want to remove him from the $20 bill, is he was not nice to Native Americans. As America gains new lands under President Jackson and others, um, they have to remove the Native Americans on these new lands. I mean, on these lands that they're expanding to, but move them out even further west. So as America grows in size, they want more land. And who's on the land? Who was there in the very beginning? Native Americans. So a lot of them are being killed, and a lot of them are being removed or displaced. And not Thomas Jefferson, Andrew Jackson decides to pass an Indian Removal Act with the help of Congress, and he forces Native Americans from eastern side of America to go out west. He makes them go to these new lands west of the Mississippi River from their native lands in eastern America. And the most famous example of this is the Cherokees in Georgia. The Cherokees were actually probably the most assimilated or civilized, as they were called back then. They are the most assimilated group of Native Americans, meaning they acquire American habits, and they start to write in English. They speak in English. As you can see, the Cherokee chief John Ross here to the left, he doesn't look like what you might think of as a stereotypical Native American. He looks more like an Englishman. He is the chief Cherokee. And so these Cherokees in Georgia, what's shocking is many of them are assimilated. They have a good relationship actually with many American citizens, but even they are forced to move to new lands, which is now in present day Oklahoma. Even they, who are quote the most civilized Native Americans, have to receive this cruel treatment. They are forced from Georgia to Oklahoma. They have to walk the entire distance, and many of them die as they walk on foot. About 15,000 Cherokees die on this trail of tears, this path that they have to take. Um, and they're not compensated. They're we well, some of you or some people said, well, they're going to get new lands. It's okay, yeah, they're being removed, but they're going to go out west and they're going to get new land. But you have to understand, that's their native lands, Georgia. That's where they've had their societies, their history. It's really cruel. And what's also cruel is Oklahoma is not at all like Georgia. Georgia is more like a swamp land. It has a lot of trees, it has a lot of grass, it's extremely fertile. Oklahoma is like it's almost like the desert. It's very dry. Later on, they find out that it has oil, but at this time, it's not meant for farming. It's nothing like Georgia. You can't, the same civilization and society that Cherokees had in Georgia, they can't reproduce it in Oklahoma. I mean, yes, they can carry some of their customs or rituals, but this is not like going from A to A. This is not equal land, equal for fertile lands. It's like going from a three-story mansion to an apartment, a small little apartment. It's just not the same. So it's a famous example, the Trail of Tears. And because of this injustice that the Native Americans faced under many American presidents, but most famously under Andrew Jackson, it's why people want to remove him from the $20 bill. Um, it's kind of this idea of like, why are we honoring a president who did these terrible things to Native Americans? So, anyway, there's this movement to remove him. And I just want to show you, this is where the Cherokee had to move. They were in part of Georgia and South Carolina, and they had to walk all through these territories into present day Oklahoma. It doesn't look like a long distance, but it is. And I also wanted to show you this because it's not just the Cherokee. Remember, there are many other Native American groups being removed from their homes. As America expands, they're being removed from their homes in Mississippi, Alabama, and later on in Louisiana, and they have to go out west. And some of them land in Oklahoma. Some of them land in other states like California, Utah, Arizona, New Mexico. So, and even in Florida, the Seminoles are removed. They have to go to New Orleans and then they're removed to Oklahoma. So it's not, again, it's an ugly part of American history, but it is what it is. Another consequence, as I said, not only because of Native American displacement, another consequence of land expansion in America is this idea of these new territories that we're gaining. First of all, after a territory has been settled, it becomes a state. So we're starting to grow in states. And so the decision has to be made. Are these new states that we're creating, are they going to have slavery or are they not going to have slavery? And so this actually becomes a very big debate in our country. And in 1820, we have what we call the Missouri Compromise. In exchange for creating Missouri, which is right in the center of America, which is going to be a slave state, the American government decides we're going to have also a free state, Maine, here. So that's how we're going to do it. Every time we have a slave state being created, we're going to try to create a free state to create an equal number, right? Um, and that's why we have a Missouri Compromise. It's this compromise that, okay, we can't decide if our new state is going to be a slave state or a free state. Well, let's create two states and let's make one of them a slave state and one of them a free state. Okay, great. That's awesome. So that's how we're going to try to compromise on this debate. Um, and here I want to show you a map of what it looks like. Missouri here and Maine here. But unfortunately, this is not so perfect, this compromise. Not every state that's created wants the federal government to decide whether they're going to be a free state or a slave state. So in the Kansas Nebraska Act, there starts to be this new decision being made by states and by these new territories that they're going to decide, the people who settle these states are going to decide whether they're going to have slavery or not slavery. It's not going to be the federal government, it's going to be the people in the state are going to decide. And this erupts into a big problem called Bleeding Kansas. And Bleeding Kansas, excuse me, this is the wrong date. Bleeding Kansas happens 4 years after the Missouri Compromise. And the Missouri Compromise happened in 1850. 4 years later, we have Bleeding Kansas. So again, instead of having the federal government decide, are they going to be a free state or slave state, the people are going to decide in that state. But the problem is the people can't decide. And in Kansas, you end up having this serious fighting and you end up in a lot of bloodshed. And that's why it's called Bleeding Kansas. Should really put quotes. And we have an image here that's now in the Kansas, I believe it's in the Kansas State House, their congressional building in Kansas. And you have an image here of John Brown, a famous individual who fights to not have slavery, but it's an image of the pro-slavery fighting against the the anti-slavery forces. And you can see how he's being ripped apart from both sides. It's a very famous image, and he's being ripped apart from both sides. And he's really symbolizing this deep division that's growing in America between people who want slavery on the right and people who don't want slavery on the left. And Bleeding Kansas happened 6 years before the Civil War. So many people say, many historians say, this is almost this is a precursor of the Civil War. This is the beginning of the Civil War, really. Bleeding Kansas, this awful bloodshed, this awful battle among pro and anti-slavery forces. As a result of this big battle between, are we going to have slavery in these new states, or are we not going to have slavery in these new states, we end up having the start of the Civil War. And unfortunately, it does begin with the election of President Lincoln. And why it begins with him is because he did not want to have slavery. He was a free soiler. He did not want to have slavery continue in the new states in America. He was anti slavery in terms of having it expand across the other states in America. He was fine with slavery and where it was in the South in the 13 colonies, but he didn't want it to grow into other states. And he said that in his election, in his campaign, and it's one of the reasons why he won, is because a lot of people liked that about him. They didn't want slavery in these new states. He was also a really eloquent speaker. I think that helped as well. And when he's elected in 1860, South Carolina, which is a slave state, says, you know what, we're done with this. We're through with this. We don't want to be part of this country anymore that is supporting anti-slavery measures. We're going to rebel, and we're going to vote to secede from the Union. And to secede just means they're going to leave from the United States. And they decide to leave. And I don't mean that they're just going to go away and come back. I mean, they secede. They legally say, we are no longer part of the United States. We are now our own separate state and country. And they do it in September of that year. And 11 more states, other states who are pro slavery, join South Carolina, and they form their own country, basically, called the Confederate States of America, or the CSA. Now, they are their own country, but no one recognizes them. Not even France or England recognizes the CSA as a separate country. So they're not quite a legitimate country, so to speak, but they see themselves as separate. So they secede from the Union, and this is really where the beginning of the Civil War starts. Something to mention is Lincoln did not want to start a war. And he even said this in his inaugural address, his speech that he made when he became president. He didn't want to actually interfere with whether we should have slavery at all in America, but he did not believe that the new states in the West should be slave states. And he also did not believe that that South Carolina seceding from the Union was legal. And later on, he believes that the federal government, the country, needs to punish states who secede from the Union because it's illegal. Under the U.S. Constitution, a state cannot secede from the government. It can't. We are a union. So Lincoln felt that it was his responsibility to punish, and to fight the Confederate states to make sure that they come back to the Union, but also to end this debate of whether the new states are going to be slave states or free states. But of course, this results in a very, very bloody debate, very bloody battle. We have a civil war because of this. And the Civil War begins on April the following year after Abraham Lincoln's election and South Carolina seceding. It begins in April of 1861. This is when we have the start of the U.S. Civil War. And it is an extremely important war, and it's something that we will learn about next lecture. So I want to stop here with my lecture. And I forgot to tell you, this here is a picture of Abraham Lincoln. And on the left here is the flag of the Confederate Army. This is the flag that the Confederate Army during the Civil War waved. And it has 3, 6, 9, 12. It has 13 stars because eventually, I believe 13 stars, 13 states joined the Confederacy. Later on, more states join. And I wanted to show you this flag because it's a flag that you might see during in movies and during TV shows. Even today, we have a debate in our country, in America, about whether people should be flying the Confederate flag. What does it really mean? It's very controversial. especially here in the South. So, anyway, thank you for being patient with me, everyone. I'm sorry this lecture was not an hour and a half, it was more like 2 hours, but we had a lot to cover. This is my email address if you want to email me. Or you can also text me on Telegram or Viber. This is my US number. And I'll be having our next lecture, which will cover the Civil War. It will cover the period after the Civil War, specifically Reconstruction, Jim Crow, the Great Migration, and Native American removals and reservations. We'll cover those big topics next lecture. So thank you. I really appreciate it. And now I'll try to look and take your questions. But before I do that, let me just leave this page on my screen. This is the Star Spangled Banner. These are the lyrics to our national anthem. And I recommend watching Whitney Houston's Star Spangled Banner. Whitney Houston, she died, but she was a very famous American singer, and she sang a beautiful Star Spangled Banner in the 1990s. So you can hear her. But these are the lyrics to our national anthem. So I want to thank you all, and let me see if I have any comments, chats. Okay, everyone. So I know you're asking questions on YouTube. So let me see what I have here that is on Zoom. I'm looking at my Zoom chat. Oh, let me move this a little to the left and I'll take your questions. Um, okay. You said, so question number one, you said you like the arts. What would you recommend to read or to watch to get acquainted with the history of America? Oh my gosh. Um, well, to be honest, movies like The Patriots, different movies that focus on different parts of American history are really good to watch. Reading, um, I'm not gonna lie. I mean, there's no one book that I can say that gives the entire history of America. There are some writers like John Ellis. Oh my gosh, who else? Let me Google this. This is terrible. American history writers. There's a few that a lot of people love. Um, oh no, these are not it. American history writers. I'm trying to think of their names off the top of my head. Um, Let me get back to you on this. Thank you for this question. There's no one book or one movie I can say about American history. There's just different ones. I read a history on Ukraine, which was really good. Serhii Plahi, and maybe I will do some research and try to find a good book that gives an overall history of America. Because as an American history major, someone who majored in international affairs and American studies, I never read one book for American history. I had to read multiple. So let me work on that. I'm going to remember this question and give you a good answer. And maybe on my last lecture, I will give you a list of good movies and good books for each period of history to read. And hopefully try to find some books or there's no one movie that gives an overall history on America, but I'm going to search. Second question, what are the most important events in the history of America that have significantly changed its vector of development as a country? So definitely this time period in terms of American history with the expansion of American land. I do not think America would be where it is today without, well, really two things. First, slavery. Slavery is extremely important to American history. It's what created our wealth because we were able to produce a lot of goods, a lot of raw materials to export. It also helped to create our capitalist system. We had many laws passed to ensure that the capital or the products that we produced from slaves was protected. So it's kind of where the birth of our capitalism comes from. But along with slavery, land is very important to our wealth because it's without land, we couldn't grow, we couldn't produce material, we couldn't expand as a population. And we are strategically located, as I can show you here. Uh, we are surrounded by water except with Mexico to our south and Canada to our north. So it's not like we're surrounded by many countries that are going to invade us. So the fact that we have our, much of our border is covered by water is very important. We don't have the fear of invasion, unlike, unfortunately, Ukraine, which is surrounded by many countries, most importantly by Russia, which it wants to invade, which Russia wants to invade Ukraine. We don't really have that problem. We have good relations with Canada. We have generally good relations with Mexico, contrary to our president right now. But another important period that has really influenced our growth as a nation, and we'll cover this later, is World War II. I would say that is actually the most important time period for America's growth in influence, its growth in wealth, and its growth in population and everything else. Um, I think that the America that we know today and that we live in today is strongly formed by the post World War II era, especially, unfortunately, with the Cold War. That also was very influential to American history. So, this time period with slavery and land expansion is important, but also World War II and after World War II is very important. Okay, question three. Thanks for the lecture. It was so detailed and interesting that I can't help but asking, do you have a oh gosh, I'm so sorry. This is a hard word for me to say. Pedagog pedagogical education. How many years experience do you have? So I'm sorry I didn't say this in the beginning of my lecture. um, my degrees are in, so I went to George Washington University. I graduated from 2011 to 2015. I went to school. I graduated in 2015, and I received my bachelor's degree in international affairs and English, or literature. We say English, but it's really literature. And then right after I received my bachelor's, um, I obtained my master's degree in American Studies. I love American history, but I really love learning about the good, the bad, the ugly. And I like learning it not from like a simple fact space, but like how did certain events shape and influence the culture, the history, or the people. That's what I really enjoy. I don't have a degree in teaching. I might get that in the future, but it's expensive, so I have to really think about it. Um, and I know I enjoy teaching. I actually was thinking about getting my PhD, but I decided I didn't want to get my PhD because I love learning and I love scholarship, but I don't love research. And when you get your PhD and when you become a professor, research is extremely important. And that to me is just not what I love. I enjoy more of this, where I get to teach you, or I get to present, we get to have discussion. So that's why I ended up not pursuing a PhD. And I went back home actually, and I taught English as a second language to Spanish speaking adults in America. And I also taught American history and civics, because the Spanish speakers that I taught, many of them were trying to get their citizenship in America. So they needed to know American history, American government, American politics. So I taught that to them. And I really enjoyed it. I recommend, if you can do something like that, teach Ukrainian or teach Russian to others, whatever, or English to others. It's a really wonderful thing to do. So thank you. Who is your favorite president of the American people? So I don't personally have a favorite president. I definitely have a least favorite president, which you'll learn about next time. I don't like Andrew Johnson. I think he's horrible. I I actually do admire George Washington, because he was the first to do so many things in America. And I appreciate the fact that he knew that slavery was wrong. So did Thomas Jefferson, but I think Thomas Jefferson had a harder time dealing with it. But I respect George Washington a lot. He has flaws. Every president has flaws. John F. Kennedy had a mistress, but I don't think, as I said to my students yesterday, it's fair to always look at presidents in just one dimension. Abraham Lincoln, I also respect, even though he was not anti slavery. in terms of like he didn't really want to get rid of it in America. Later he did because he saw how harmful it was. I still respect him because he was able to keep the union together. I think he changed as a person, as a president, so I respect that. So, but I don't really have a favorite one, honestly. Barack Obama isn't even my favorite president, and I'm personally a Democrat. But that doesn't mean I don't respect Obama. I don't respect, and it doesn't mean I don't respect even George Bush. I mean, it's very difficult to be president of the United States. You can see how it ages them. If you look at Obama in 2008 and Obama in 2016, he looks different. He has a lot more white hair. So, um, the lecture was perfect. Question number 5. I have one question. Did America become such a rich and prosperous country thanks to capitalism? Yes, indeed. Absolutely. But it also became rich and prosperous because of slavery. And this is a really hard thing to explain. And I think I'm going to try to explain it next lecture. But slavery was both supportive of capitalism, it helped to make capitalism grow, but it was also antithetical to capitalism, because slaves don't receive a wage, they're property, they're not human. And so you're not really having a free market society because of it. So it's a little bit complicated, the relationship between slavery and capitalism. But yes, capitalism and our support for capitalism is why we became so rich and prosperous, I think. However, ironically, too, we also became rich and prosperous because the federal government had a hand in it. So, yes, we're a very pro capitalist country, but there are many of us who also now support having a hand from the government, um, meaning that the government kind of becomes the invisible hand that supports and allows government and allows capitalism to continue in our country. Um, Really, what we have in our country is what I call socialist capitalism. We have capitalism in the sense that we support people having their own businesses, making their own free decisions in terms of their personal lives, but also business lives. But we also have an invisible hand from our government. The socialist part is that our government makes sure that people are not abusing the system of capitalism, that they're following the laws, that capitalism is in some ways ironically regulated, because capitalism isn't always good. It certainly can be wonderful for a country, but if it's completely unchecked, if there's no oversight for capitalism, you can have people become very greedy. They can become very rich, and they can abuse others. If they have no laws or regulations, you can have so many people who are rich and then an even larger number of people who are poor. Like, you need some sort of regulations to make sure that people aren't abused by the capitalist system. So, but personally, like, I think that's the best system, actually. Like, I think it's important for the government to have a hand in our economic system. Like right now during this coronavirus, I don't know what we would do if we had no help from our federal government. I think it would be horrible. We would have an even worse economic recession. We would have an even greater unemployment rate, depression, even, which we might even have still. But we would be in a worse off situation if the federal government didn't pass an economic bill to help to help businesses and American people. We passed a bill, I think, a week ago that was $2 trillion worth, but it's supposed to help our businesses during this time of coronavirus. So if we only had capitalism, we would have no help. So anyway, it's things like that. Um, Thanks for all that info. This is question number 6. As I understood, slaves had no rights at all at that time, right? Sorry if I didn't catch that. No, it's okay. Don't be sorry. You are absolutely correct. Slaves had no rights because they were not humans. They were not citizens. They weren't humans. I mean, they were humans. Literally, you could see them. They had feelings, they had desires, they had hopes, but they were not treated under the eyes of the law and the eyes of the government. They were not humans. They were property. They were like cattle. They were like swine. Um, and so they had no rights. They could not read, or some of them read, but they taught themselves from other people, but they had no formal education. They could not move around where they wanted to. Slaves were often separated from their mothers, from their children too. It's a really horrible system. Um, and be mindful too, if you watch some American movies like Gone with the Wind, or you visit, or you hear about American plantations in the South, there are some people in America who romanticize slavery. They think that, oh, slavery wasn't that bad. Slaves were treated well, they were fed. Sometimes they were treated better than, white folks. But, in some ways, it doesn't matter if you gave a slave the best room, the best food. The fact that they had no freedom to decide what they wanted to, under the eyes of the law, it doesn't matter how well you treat them, which they weren't treated well at all. They had no rights, and there's nothing you could say or do to justify that. They had no say. They were sold off when their master wanted to. If they tried to leave, they were punished or killed. And if they were punished or killed, their master had no repercussions, no consequences whatsoever. So I can't imagine what that's like. Obviously, I can't. Um, there's something similar that Ukraine experienced, and that's serfdom. Serfdom is not the same as slavery, but it's similar in the sense that there are many poor people, farmers, and serfs who were controlled by an overseer, a master of the home, or a lord kind of thing. And I know that many serfs had also no rights. Their families didn't have any rights, but this was not a permanent status. And it was not as brutal, I believe, from what I've read. It's not as brutal as slavery. I mean, you could just do whatever you wanted to, and you could kill. And what's so awful about slavery is that it was never just for that person, it was for that person's mother, it was for that slave's daughter or son and their grandchildren. It continued through lineage. Okay, number 7. You explain everything a lot easier than they teach at our local universities. Thanks. Okay, well, thank you. Now, to be fair, I am a native. Well, actually, I'm not a Native American, and I don't mean that like I'm from an Indian tribe. I mean I wasn't born in America. I was actually born in Russia, but I was adopted by two American people, my parents, and who are American, so I grew up essentially in America. So it was easy. I live here, so it's easy for me to understand American history, to see it. Um, and I mean, I don't know how I would do if I had to teach Ukrainian history. I don't think I would do a very good job, to be honest. Even though I read about about Ukrainian history, it's not the same when you hear it from a native resident. But thank you for that comment, that compliment. How did the Second Amendment appear? How did the government decide to allow citizens to bear weapons? Was it a necessity? Very good question. Yes, it was. In early American history, as I said, even before the American Revolution, we had no formal army because before American Revolution, we weren't a country. Britain was our country, so they had the weapons, they had the army, the navy. Now we did have American residents or citizens who had their own weapons to defend themselves, to go hunting. And it's because of them that we have these small groups of people that formed to what we call militias, small little military groups. And they were crucial. They're very important to our founding, and they're very important, I think, to our success as a nation, especially with the American Revolution. Um, and that's why we have the Second Amendment, because when America was founded, we wanted to make sure that people had the right to defend themselves as they did in early American history. Um, we wanted to make sure that if people need to defend themselves, whether it's against a robber, a thief, or even the federal government, that they had that right. But what's tricky about this with the Second Amendment is the America of 1620, the America of 1776, the America of 1850 is not quite the America that we have now. Um, our world is different, and we have a lot of people in our country who have guns, and many of them are law abiding. They don't shoot people, they don't kill people. They have them for self defense. They have them for hunting. They have them for fun. Some people just want to go shooting. But the problem is that we have today that they didn't have during George Washington's time is we have mass shootings. We have people who are inspired by this idea that, you know what, I feel angry with the world. I hate this country, or I hate this group of people for whatever reason, and they decide, you know what, I'm going to take my gun, my semi-automatic weapon, my M16, my AK-47. I'm going to go out and shoot a bunch of people because I feel angry with the world. And that's the problem that we face today, that our founding fathers who wrote the Constitution, who created the Constitution, did not have to face. They didn't have to think about the idea of mass shootings. And so today, now we have to figure out, how do we respect the Second Amendment, but also protect American citizens from each other, from mass shootings? Um, I mean, the thing is, we do regulate free speech. You know, you can't say whatever you want. So there are many people who say, well, we have to regulate the Second Amendment. We have to make sure that people who have criminal histories maybe don't have guns. People who might have bad intentions on the internet not have guns. But then there are others who say, you know, the moment you start to limit this Second Amendment is the moment you start to take away the entire amendment. So that's the debate we have in our country, unfortunately. Um, okay, and let's see. I think another question is, good evening and morning. I know. Thank you. What about the Indians? Were they part of American society or existed only within their reservations? Oh, very good question. Um, this is both a good thing and a bad thing that I'm giving you this lecture. The good the good thing about this lecture is that I'm happy to inform you about American history, to explain it to you. But the bad thing is that I'm explaining American history I'm explaining 100 years within an hour and a half, 2 hours. And as a result of that, I have to speak about groups of people in a general way, and at times in a stereotypical way, and that includes Native Americans. So, yes, many Native Americans were removed from their homes, but many Native Americans weren't. Many of them were able to create and live in their societies in New England. Some of them were able to intermarry, intermix. Um, some of them were able to become more American and no longer retain their Native Americanness. So you know, it's hard because I want to tell you about Native Americans, but at the same time, I can't tell you about them because there is a very complicated history with Native Americans. Each Native American group, tribe, reservation is different from one another. Some of them are living on reservations, yes. Some of them are very integrated into society. I would say the Cherokees, this is what's so weird about them, is they were very integrated into American society. They were very assimilated. But even they too could not avoid the awful injustice that faced Native Americans. And many Native Americans did get removed from their native lands. Many of them were killed, many of them were attacked. And that was, as a result, too, many of them had to fight back. Many of Native Americans also had to attack and kill Americans because they had to defend themselves. Um, but I will speak more about Native Americans next lecture, too, because we start to have a growing stereotype about Native Americans. And I'll talk about that next lecture. All right. And the last two comments, I like to attend your lecture of history somewhere in the university for real. Well, I would too, but unfortunately, I'm in the United States right now. I don't know when I'll go back to Ukraine. I plan to stay here till my Fulbright ends, which is in June. Maybe in the fall, I will come and visit Ukraine again. But unfortunately, for the upcoming months, I'll be in America, especially with this coronavirus. I don't know what's going to happen. Right now, I'm in self-isolation till April, but I don't know if we'll have this in May and June too. So, but I appreciate you at least listening to the lecture, so thank you. And then the last comment is, hello, Maria. Glad to meet you here. Thank you for such an informative lecture. Okay. All right. Well, thank you guys. I appreciate it. And again, the next lecture will be April 19th, 2020, this year, sometime in the evening. I think it will be at 5:30, which is or 6:30. I'm not sure actually. 6:30, 18:30 in the evening, but follow Facebook. This is all being given through 1991 in Mariupol, Ukraine. So like them on Facebook, follow them on Facebook, and that's how you will hear about my lectures. So thank you everyone for joining me. I hope you enjoyed it, and I appreciate you attending. Okay, and feel free to email me or call me. Okay. And I look forward to our next lecture. Thank you. All right.
Yeah, Maria, thank you for the lecture.
Yeah,
Yeah,
I'm really sorry I went over time. Again, it's hard.
I hope Igor did everything right and he stopped the recording.